The glass hit the floor, and the room went silent before my breath returned. Lena said, "It was me." My name slipped from Evan like a prayer and a curse. I stared at the cracked phone, lit with texts that didn't belong to me. Lena said, "You were never supposed to see that." My voice shook as I asked how long the lie had lived between us. Evan said, "Please listen," but the word "please" sounded like ash. The party buzz outside the kitchen thinned into a ringing void. Noah stepped into the doorway and froze at the wreckage. Lena said, "It's not what you think," and the old line felt cruel in the new light. Memory crashed hard and fast, louder than the glass. I remembered sleepovers, promises, and the kind of trust that made us fearless. I asked if any of it had been real, and Lena blinked slow, like the truth hurt to drag out. Evan said, "I made a mistake, and I heard a door inside me lock." Noah said, "Maya, breathe." But breathing felt like betrayal too. The phone kept glowing, a lighthouse for liars. I whispered, "How could you?" And the kitchen finally answered with thunder. The storm had not started in the sky. It started months ago in small silences I mistook for rest. Lena said, "You work too hard," and I believed she meant care. Evan said, "She worries about you," and I let that balm numb a bruise I could not name. We shared playlists, recipes, and the spare key shaped like a heart. I kept her secrets like folded notes in a shoebox. Noah said, "You two are a fortress," and I smiled like a gate that never locks. Late nights blurred into coffee dawns. A laugh from Lena could lift a week. I fixed her resume at midnight and cheered her new job over tacos. She framed my first gallery print above her couch. I thought love among friends had no shadow. When she missed my call, I called back softer. When she forgot my opening, I forgave it with flowers. Evan said, "She's been stressed," and I said I understood. I did not understand that stress can grow teeth. I did not see the bite marks until they ached in the open light. The first crack sounded like nothing at all. Lena said, "I'll be there," and the hour passed without her shadow on the wall. Evan handed me water and said, "She got pulled into something." I nodded and felt foolish for wanting my best friend more than applause. I stared at the empty chair we saved for her. Noah said, "She never misses your shows," and the doubt slid under my ribs. The messages turned brief and bright, like sparklers that burn out fast. Week by week, plans bent and broke. I told myself she needed space, and I held the door wide. Evan said, "You know she loves you," and that word, love, felt like a decal over a crack. I stopped asking questions that sounded like begging. I stopped counting the no-shows, then counted them again in the dark. When she did appear, her smile carried a shadow. I kept feeding the trust like a fire starved of air. The flames flickered and the smoke stung, but I called it warm. The night we celebrated her promotion, Lena hugged me tight and then stood an inch too far. She said, "I owe you," and the words sounded rehearsed. Evan laughed at a story, and she watched him like it was a mirror. I told myself I was jealous of the attention. Noah said, "Take the win," and I tried to swallow the splinter. We toasted with cheap champagne. Lena said, "To us always," and I clinked glass to promise. The music swelled, and I caught her checking her phone with a smile that wasn't for me. I told myself it was a recruiter or a meme. A whisper passed between them and fell quiet when I turned. I set a plate in front of her and found my hands shaking. Evan said, "You okay?" And I said I was just tired. The word tired hid 100 smaller words like doubt, ache, and fear. The party lights spun, and my stomach kept time with the slow spin of the room. By the time thunder shook the glass, I had already learned the sound of things breaking. The texts on the phone were proof, but the proof arrived late to a party the heart had thrown months ago. Lena said, "I didn't mean to hurt you," and I remembered every time I gave her the bigger slice. Evan said, "It just happened," and I saw how choices dress up as accidents. Noah said, "Tell the truth," and the night held its breath. I thought of shared keys and spare beds, And the apartment plant we co-parented like a joke. I thought of every picture where our shoulders touched. My voice came out small and then grew teeth. I said I wanted the whole story. And I wanted it now. Lena looked at the floor and then at him. The triangle drew itself sharp in the space between us. Somewhere outside the storm moved on. Inside, it finally arrived. The summer air smelled of cut grass and melting ice cream. Lena said, "Race you to the swings." And I followed barefoot through the park. We were 12, and the world felt like a backyard. The chains groaned as we soared higher, laughter spilling into the blue sky. I said, "We'll never grow old," and she promised with pinky fingers locked. Evan was there too, sketchbook in hand, pretending he was above it all, but smiling when we shoved him. Noah joined later, dragging a kite that refused to rise, and we laughed until our stomachs hurt. Those afternoons stitched us together tighter than any vow. Lena said, "This is forever," and I believed her, because at 12 the word forever fit in your pocket. We carved our initials into the wood post and hid them under stickers, thinking no one would ever peel them away. The light bent gold, and I kept a pebble she handed me like a charm. Looking back, the pebble still feels heavier than her betrayal ever should. Years later, the smell of rain on pavement pulled me back to that swing set. Lena said, "Do you remember when we ruled the park?" And I laughed into my hood. We were 16, waiting out a storm under the bus stop. Our shoes were soaked, but our secrets stayed dry. I told her about the boy I liked, and she grinned like she already knew. She whispered hers, and the storm felt like applause. Evan walked us home, sketchbook tucked safe under his jacket. Noah cracked jokes that barely hid his shiver. Lena said, "We'll tell our kids this someday," and I let myself believe that storms pass but bonds don't. I kept my heart tucked in her pocket without question. We traded music through wired earbuds, head against head, every lyric a vow. I thought thunder was the only thing that could shake us. I didn't know silence could be louder. At 18, the world opened wider, but we carried each other through. Lena said, "College letters don't change us," and I believed her. We sprawled on her bedroom floor, magazines scattered like confetti. I read aloud dreams I wasn't sure belonged to me. She traced circles on the ceiling with her finger, as if she could rewrite the stars. Evan snapped Polaroids of us, claiming we looked like a band no one had heard of yet. Noah balanced sodas on his forehead until we cried with laughter. I said, "Promise me distance won't win," and Lena pressed her hand to mine, swearing she'd always be my anchor. I tucked the Polaroid into my journal, edges curling over time. That night smelled of nail polish and popcorn, the kind of night you think nothing can touch. I didn't know some promises rot in silence long before they break. The night before I left for college, Lena sneaked into my room through the window like when we were kids. She said, "You can't leave me here," half a joke, half a plea. We lay on the bed staring at glow-in-the-dark stars that barely clung to the ceiling. I said, "We'll call every day," and she nodded, eyes glistening. Evan dropped by with a stack of mixtapes he made, handing them out like talismans. Noah stood at the doorway with snacks, pretending he wasn't about to cry. Lena pressed a bracelet into my palm, braided with thread the color of storm clouds. She said, "Now you can't forget me," and I swore I never could. That night, the crickets outside hummed in rhythm with our promises. I believed we were untouchable. Belief is dangerous when the ground is already shifting. In the years that followed, our bond became my compass. Lena said, "I'll visit soon," and I waited like a child at the window. She did come, and when she laughed in my kitchen, it felt like time had folded. Evan cooked pancakes at midnight, pretending he was a chef. Noah played old songs on his phone, until we sang ourselves hoarse. For a while, it was easy to forget that cracks were forming beneath the paint. We piled into cars for road trips, shouting lyrics into open air. We traded jackets when nights grew cold. Lena said, "See, nothing's changed," and I let the warmth of her words mask the draft creeping in. I kept those memories like pressed flowers, fragile but still bright. I didn't know some flowers crumble the moment you touch them again. The days after the storm felt like walking on wet paper. Lena said, "Let's reset," as if a word could mop a flood. Evan said, "We can fix this," and his stare held a plea I did not know how to honor. I kept my voice even and small, the way you hold glass that already cracked. The group chat went quiet, except for logistics. Noah said, "I'm here," and the steadiness in him made the silence elsewhere louder. Lena started arriving late and leaving early. She laughed too brightly and looked past me by an inch. I asked simple questions and got complicated echoes. Evan said, "It's just stress," and I felt the old decal slide over a deeper fracture. I counted the times she reached for me and stopped midair. I noticed how his stories placed him where she had been. I learned the shape of absence and wore it like a coat. At night I scrolled photos like a rosary, and my thumb burned. Trust used to be a door that swung open on touch. Now every hinge complained. The first rumor arrived, dressed like a kindness. A coworker said, "I saw them laughing by the river," and smiled as if laughter could not bruise. I nodded and swallowed a shard. That night, Lena said, "People talk," and the words crawled over my skin. Evan said we only grabbed tacos, and they only sliced the sentence into smaller pieces. I asked why I was the last to know simple things. He blinked slow and said, "It slipped my mind." Noah walked me home and did not fill the air with noise. He said, "You know your own weather," and I felt the forecast turn. My phone glowed with texts that skimmed the surface and never dove. I started measuring apologies like rainfall. I started keeping score against my will. Lena said, "Don't make this bigger," and I wondered who had made it small. I wanted solid ground and got fog. I asked Lena to meet me where we first carved our initials. She arrived with perfume that used to smell like home. She said, "You're reading shadows," and I felt my ribs tighten. I pointed to the ways she vanished from days that had our names on them. She shrugged and said, "Grown life is messy." Evan called mid-sentence as if summoned, and the sky dimmed another shade. I let it ring, and her gaze followed the sound. Noah texted a single word, "Breathe," and the phone felt heavier. I told her I needed the truth without decorations. She said, "The truth is you're scared of losing me," and I heard how she shaped the knife to fit my hand. I said, "Fear is not the same as fiction." A wind tossed leaves across our old bench, and I remembered summer tongues stained with ice pops. Memory is a generous liar. It kept trying to donate warmth to a cold room. That weekend I opened a shared folder to send Lena a file, and saw a string of late-night edits tagged with Evan's name. Titles we had whispered over ramen appeared in their private track changes. Lena said, "We were just cleaning it up when I asked." The "we" bit me. Evan said, "You were asleep," and the sentence turned my rest into permission. I tried to slow my pulse and read the comments like clues. They finished a pitch we started together. They deleted my line breaks and signed their names side by side. Noah said, "What did they promise you?" And the question knocked the wind from my chest. I stood in my kitchen, the hum of the fridge louder than any apology. I remembered the bracelet braided like storm clouds and wondered when it frayed. I typed a message and erased it 5 times. The cursor blinked like a heartbeat I no longer trusted. By Monday, the story had split into versions. Lena said, "You're overreacting," and the word over tried to push me under. Evan said, "We did it for the deadline," and I tasted metal. I asked to see every message, every file, every plan. They traded a glance like a coin. Noah stood with me in the lobby and said, "You don't need permission to know your worth." The elevator doors mirrored 4 faces that no longer matched their names. I felt the weight of my own quiet and chose to set it down. I said we bring it all into daylight. No edits, no staging. Lena crossed her arms and rolled her shoulders like a boxer. Evan looked at his shoes and then at me, and I saw the part of him that wanted to be good lose its footing. The day stretched wide and thin. Somewhere, a hinge prepared to break. The truth did not arrive with thunder, but with a whisper that cut deeper. Lena said, "I love him," and the room dropped away. Evan said, "It wasn't supposed to happen," but his eyes betrayed the relief of confession. My voice cracked as I asked how long, and silence filled the gap with knives. She looked at me like a stranger forced to share my skin. "Noah," said, "say it all now," and his tone carved through the fog. Lena said, "Since last winter," and my chest burned. Evan shifted like a boy caught stealing, muttering, "I never meant to hurt you," as if intent could erase impact. Every photo of us flashed in my head and turned to ash. My breath came jagged, and the years of trust split in seconds. I thought betrayal would roar, but it whispered, and the whisper sounded final. The confession replayed in my skull like a cruel echo. Lena said, "You weren't supposed to find out like this," and I laughed, the sound breaking apart in my throat. Evan reached for my hand, but I recoiled, the touch burning. Noah said, "Stop hiding behind excuses," his patience unraveling. Lena's tears slid down her cheeks, but they looked like performance. I said, "Every lie wore her face, and I kept believing it." Evan said, "I thought you'd hate me forever," and the word forever snapped like brittle wood. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was a battlefield where no one moved. I wanted to scream, but the weight of years pressed me quiet. The walls held memories, but the room belonged to betrayal now. I demanded the truth in detail, and Lena flinched before answering. She said, "It started with late nights we told you were work," and I felt my ribs lock. Evan said, "I didn't want it to mean anything, but meaning bled from every glance between them." Noah whispered, "Maya, you don't owe them grace," and the words struck true. My hands shook as I clutched the bracelet she once gave me, now feeling like a chain. Lena said, "I loved you too in a different way," and my chest collapsed under the weight of twisted affection. I said, "You don't get to rewrite love as mercy." Evan looked at the floor, his silence a louder betrayal than words. The air between us thickened until breathing became war. The memory of loyalty cracked in pieces under the weight of their words. Lena said, "You have to believe me. It wasn't about replacing you," but her voice betrayed the lie. Evan said, "We couldn't stop," and his confession sounded like surrender. I said, "You didn't just betray me. You betrayed every version of us we could have been." Noah's face tightened, anger masked as restraint. The storm outside slammed rain against glass, echoing the chaos within. Lena tried to touch my hand, but I recoiled, her fingers catching empty air. She whispered, "Please don't hate me," and I heard the absurdity of the plea. Hate would be easier than this hollowed ache. By the end of that night, nothing remained untouched. Lena said, "We can still fix this," and the sentence collapsed before it reached me. Evan said, "We're sorry," and the word we cut deeper than the truth itself. Noah broke his silence with, "You lost her, both of you, and maybe that's justice." My throat burned as I whispered, "I am not your home anymore." The finality settled heavier than rage. The storm outside quieted, but inside, silence thundered. The walls knew 1,000 secrets, but they would only remember this one. The bond that once defined us was dead, and all that lingered was its ghost. Morning cracked open like a fault line, and I chose the battlefield. I texted them to meet at the gallery where my work first hung. Noah said, "You set the terms," and the steadiness steadied me. Lena arrived first and tried to smile at the walls that once held our victories. Evan came after, eyes swollen from a night that fixed nothing. I said, "No scripts, no edits, just truth." The room swallowed our echoes. Lena said, "I will answer anything," and her voice trembled at the word anything. Evan said, "I will not dodge," and guilt shaped his posture. I placed the bracelet on the plinth like an artifact from a vanished age. I asked who told the first lie, and who protected it most. Silence lifted its head and stared us down. Noah said, "Begin," and the air thin to a wire. My heart beat against it and refused to bleed. I drew a circle on the floor with blue painter's tape and asked them to stand inside it. I said, "This is the space where we do not lie." Lena stepped in and whispered, "I crossed lines because I felt small next to you." Her words stuck like burrs. Evan stepped in and said, "I wanted to be chosen by someone who knew me first." The floor held the weight of admissions. I felt a heat behind my ribs that was older than this week. I said, "You stole from us, and then you called it need." Noah exhaled slow, guarding stillness like a wall. Lena said, "I envied how people loved you without asking." The envy sounded like a mirror I could not break. Evan said, "I thought I could be better if she looked at me that way." I tasted metal and named it grief. The circle did not save us, but it recorded us. I placed printed copies of the shared files on a bench and watched their faces. I said, "Every margin note is a footprint in snow." Lena said, "I rewrote the pitch because I wanted to prove I could lead." The word lead stung like lemon on a wound. Evan said, "I added my name because we built it together once, and the once scraped me raw." I showed them the timeline and how my hours vanished from it. Noah said intent does not erase impact, and the room agreed. Lena pressed fingers to her temple and said, "I did not want to lose you." I answered that loss is not prevented by stealing. Evan whispered, "Tell me how to fix it," and I heard a child under the man. I said the fix is not a trick but a cost. I said we pay in truth, and in distance, and in letting go. The confrontation burned into confession, and then into verdict. I said, "You chose each other in the dark and left me to light the room." Lena said, "I can leave the project and the circle if you want." The offer sounded like a bandage on a broken bone. Evan said, "I will step back and credit your work in full." I waited for my pulse to settle and listened for the truth under their promises. Noah said, "Repair begins where advantage ends, and the line cut clean." I said there would be no more late nights in secret. I said my work would carry only the hands that honored it. Lena nodded and folded into herself. Evan swallowed hard and said, "Understood." The gallery lights hummed like bees. The hive in my chest quieted, but it did not forget. When it was done, I lifted the painter's tape and threw the loop in the trash. I said we end this here, and we begin something different. Lena whispered, "Will you ever forgive me?" And the air held its breath. Evan said, "I will keep distance," and the distance sounded like mercy for all of us. Noah touched my shoulder and said, "You chose yourself." My throat hurt with a relief that did not feel like victory. I gathered the files and the bracelet, and felt the weight change in my hand. I said, "Return the keys, and take your names off what is mine." They nodded, and it looked like surrender, not penance. The gallery door opened to bright noon, and the world did not notice our ruin. I stepped into the light and did not look back. The hinge did not break. It held as I closed the door. Dawn found me on the river path where the city breathes slow. My legs moved because thinking hurt. Noah said, "Name what you carry," and the fog lifted a little. I said, "I carried the echo of a house with no roof." He nodded and kept pace without crowding me. The wind off the water stung and felt clean. Lena's words floated up like trash I kept picking from the tide. Evan said, "I never meant harm," and the sentence still burned. I watched the skyline trade night for steel. Noah said grief has chapters, and I let the lines settle. I promised myself a chapter that did not begin with them. The sun broke thin and honest. I let it write the first line on my skin. Back home, I made space for the life I wanted. I boxed the souvenirs that only knew her name. The bracelet stayed on the table like weather. I opened the shared drive and changed the permissions. My hands shook, then steadied. I wrote the credits clean and simple. Noah texted, "Proud of you," and the screen warmed my palm. I brewed coffee and did not taste regret in it. The apartment sounded different without the old ringtone. Silence tried on the shape of peace. I said, "This is mine," and the room agreed. Outside, traffic braided a new rhythm. Lena asked to meet in a public place where words behave. We chose the small museum with the quiet stairs. She said, "I miss us," and the sentence flickered like a failing bulb. I said we were a bridge that met the wrong river. She swallowed and asked for a path back. I said there is forward or nothing. She reached for my hand and paused midair. I did not move to fill the space. She said, "I will carry the blame." And I told her blame has poor wheels. We stood among statues that outlived their makers. Noah waited outside and did not text. I walked away before the echo faded. The door sighed like closure done right. Evan asked for 5 minutes and chose the park where winters bite. He said, "I am returning what is not mine," and handed over a folder of notes. I saw my handwriting like a lighthouse. He said he ended it with her for a while, then stared at the ground. I said endings that protect me are the only ones I accept. He nodded as if learning a new alphabet. He asked if I could forgive him someday. I said, "Forgiveness is a door I keep locked for now." He thanked me for telling the truth even when it cost. I left him there with the frost and the birds. The folder felt lighter than it should. Weeks later, my new series opened, in a small space with tall light. The prince held grief without begging. Noah said, "Look at you," and I let the praise land. Friends filled the room, and none of them wore a mask of apology. I spoke about process and not about pain. A song from our old playlists drifted in and did not hollow me out. I saw my reflection glassy and unafraid. The gallery owner asked about future work, and I said the word future without flinching. Outside, night folded gentle around the block. I felt the shape of my heart, scar and all, and it fit. Morning found me wide awake, not brittle, but clear. I brewed coffee and counted the quiet as a gift. Noah said, "Peace is loud when you have earned it." I smiled because the room finally recognized me. My phone buzzed with a message I did not open. I set it face down and let the steam rise. I walked the apartment and touched each frame I chose to keep. The walls felt lighter without the weight of pretending. Lena had once filled every corner with echoes. Evan had left fingerprints on my plans. I wiped the glass and saw only my face. "Noah," said forward, "looks good on you." I said, "I am still here." The truth settled in my bones like sun. I met Lena on a corner neither of us owned. She said, "I'm trying to be better," and held the air like a fragile thing. I nodded because some roads require silence to pass. We stood with a crosswalk counting down between us. She asked, "Are we ever friends again?" I said, "We were an era, not a loop." Her eyes watered and cleared. Cars hissed by like rain without clouds. I wished her gentleness she never found with me. She whispered, "Thank you for telling the truth." I stepped back when the light changed. The city swallowed the moment and kept moving. At home, I opened the archive we built and chose what to keep. I deleted the thread where apologies learned to lie. I moved the photos to a folder named Winter and let them cool there. Evan emailed a formal correction with full credit. I replied with one line that said receive. Noah said, "You do not owe anyone a ceremony." I closed the laptop and breathed like the air was new. I placed the bracelet in a small box and tied it shut. Some relics deserve darkness to rest. I labeled the lid with a single word, finished, and meant it. I walked to the park where we once flew higher than fear. The carved initials hid under old stickers and new weather. I pressed my palm to the wood and felt the past without bleeding. Noah joined me and said, "Some ghosts learn to mind their manners." I laughed because the wind agreed. I left a small flower at the base and took nothing else. I did not need proof that I survived. The sky opened blue in every direction. I whispered a goodbye no one could overhear. The bench kept our story but not our ending. Night returned with a softness I trusted. The gallery lights dimmed behind me as we locked up. Friends peeled off into cabs, and the street hummed like a promise. Noah said, "You did not break, you changed." I felt every seam where I had been stitched stronger. I looked at my reflection in a dark window and did not flinch. I thought of the girl on the swing who believed in forever. I let her rest and chose tomorrow. My voice came out steady and small as a blade. I said, "I lost my best friend the day I found out who she really was."